30 years ago, in the Melbourne seaside suburb of Frankston.
Good evening. The serial killer who murdered 3 women at...
Content of this next story is pretty tough. Stalked the streets of Melbourne, plucking young women at random and brutally killing them.
At around 11 p.m. on a warm February night in 1993, a young couple named Les and Donna returned home from work and were confronted with the horrific scene. On their lounge room wall, next to the television and written in blood, were the words, "Dead Don." Lying on their kitchen floor lay the viciously disemboweled body of Donna's cat, Buffy, which was covered by a picture of a bikini-clad woman. Its blood was dragged across the floor and splattered on the walls. In the middle of the chaos, in thick, terrifying letters, "Donna, you're dead." Buffy's 2 kittens were also found slaughtered in the bathroom, floating in a bath of water. In the main bedroom, the intruder ransacked every drawer. Their clothes were ripped and strewn everywhere. Engagement photos were slashed, mirrors were smeared with shaving cream, and lewd photographs were shredded across the room. Whoever did this wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. Over a period of 7 short weeks, the Victorian seaside suburb of Frankston and their surrounding areas would be terrorised by a deranged serial killer. 3 young women would be murdered, and only one would escape. On the treacherously wet night of Saturday, 12th of June 1993, a man searching for pine branches stumbled across the body of a partially clothed young woman in Lloyd Park on Cranbourne Road, Langwarrin. By the time the police had arrived at around 8 p.m, the weather condition had worsened, with heavy rain and pelting winds washing away crucial evidence. The killer made little attempt to hide his work, covering her body with only a small pine branch. The autopsy examination revealed that she had a number of bruises and abrasions on her arms and hands, which suggested that there may have been an attempt at defending herself, but there were no knife injuries to her arms or her head. Police suspected that the woman had lost consciousness via strangulation before she was stabbed and had her throat cut. This would also later be confirmed during the autopsy after the presence of small hemorrhages within the tissue lying inside her eyelids were discovered. A crisscross pattern was cut into her chest, causing concern with the police. They wondered if the killing was a result of a satanic ritual or if the killer was simply chasing a thrill. The crime scene was searched the following morning once the treacherous conditions had passed. In an area not far from where her body was located, a blue and white sports bag which contained a number of school books would be found. Written on them was the name Elizabeth. Police were able to quickly confirm her identity as 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens, who was reported missing the evening prior. She was found only 250 metres away from her home. Elizabeth was originally living in Tasmania, but moved to Victoria to complete her Victorian Certificate of Education. There seemed to be no motive as to why she would be so brutally murdered, which made the investigation for the police and detectives extremely difficult. Police reached out to the public, dressing mannequins in her clothes, distributing pamphlets, and undertaking roadblocks. Their efforts resulted in witnesses coming forward with information, stating that she was seen at Frankston TAFE and a takeaway food bar at around 7 p.m. the evening prior to her discovery. Less than a month later, on Thursday, 8th of July 1993, 41-year-old Rosa Toth was headed home from Seaford Railway Station. By the time she walked past Seaford North Reserve, she noticed a man loitering near the toilet block and was attacked behind shortly after. In their struggle, she offered the man an expensive ring, but he refused to take it. Rosa was dragged to an unlit section of the park, but managed to break free after the assailant held a gun to her head, which she quickly realised was fake. She gave the man a forceful push and ran back to the main road, but nobody stopped for her. The man caught up to her, pulled her hair and told her to be quiet, to which she nodded in agreement, feigning obedience, but again, she managed to escape. Only this time she was able to stop a car and flee the scene. Rosa escaped with only minor injuries before the man fled on foot into the park. An hour later, after Rosa was attacked, 22-year-old Deborah, known as Debbie Freem, had her friend over at her home for a casual dinner. Debbie was in high spirits as just 12 days earlier, she had welcomed her first child, a young baby boy, into the world. During dinner preparation, Debbie realised that she didn't have any milk for the omelette that she was preparing, so she left her newborn with her friend and went to the local store in Seaford, claiming she would only be a few minutes. Her guest waited for an hour, and realized that something was wrong when Debbie hadn't returned home. Debbie's friend and boyfriend would drive around the local area trying to find her, before eventually reporting her missing to police at Frankston Police Station. In the coming days, police would discover Debbie's silver Datsun Pulsar in a nearby area, noticing a large dent in the bonnet and license plate. The police didn't find groceries or her wallet in the car. However, they did discover other deeply unsettling evidence. The driver's seat was in a reclined position and was pushed all the way back. Seemingly, someone much larger than Debbie was driving the vehicle. A blade of grass stained with blood was found on the passenger side seat, and more blood would be located on the driver's car seat. The blood would later be tested and was found to be that of Debbie Freems. 4 days after she went missing on 12th of July, Debbie's partially covered body would be found by a local farmer between a fence and trees in grazing paddocks on Taylor's Road, Carrum Downs, about a 10-minute drive from where she was living. Like Elizabeth, she had also been strangled, only this time it was with a cord. Her abdomen had been savagely stabbed multiple times, and her throat was slashed in a frenzied attack. The police had strong suspicions that the two murders were linked based on the modus operandi, the timing, their locations of discovery, and the killer's methods of disposal. It was clear that the killer's appetite for murder was developing, and women in the suburban area were quickly becoming fearful for their safety. Criminal profiler Claude Minicini assessed the murders to aid in providing some insight to the individual committing the murders. He created a profile of the culprit based on the typical characteristics of a serial killer. Serial killers usually start their killings between the ages of 18 to 24 and often live a rich fantasy life. They get a pleasure out of fantasizing about selecting their victims, how they're going to kill them, and what they're going to experience during the killing. As they're constantly fantasizing, it often makes it difficult for them to hold down a meaningful job. Based on the typical profile and the evidence that they had gathered, they suspected that the killer was likely a local resident, someone who blended into the community. More than 150 officers from every Victorian police squad were now involved in what was dubbed Operation Pulsar, which involved door-knocking the area and searching for leads. The police created a questionnaire targeting the suspected area in Frankston, just as another young girl went missing. On the morning of Friday, 30th of July, 1993, 17-year-old student Natalie Russell left for school during heavy rain, but by the time she left school for the day at 2:30 p.m, she would never be heard from again. Her parents became concerned and would contact the police at around 6:15 p.m. Fearing that she may have been attacked while walking home from school, the police would search along Natalie's usual route home, which included a shortcut along a bike track bound between two golf courses. By 11 p.m. that night, the police would discover peculiar-looking cuts in the perimeter cyclone fencing. Upon further inspection, a bloody handprint would be identified against one of the galvanized steel posts. Investigating deeper, they would find a school bag, a pair of black stockings, and ultimately, a girl in a school uniform. Immediately, the officers knew that the body belonged to Natalie. From what the officers saw at the scene, they could tell that Natalie put up a fight against her perpetrator, but the killer overpowered her. Just like the two victims before her, Natalie suffered from multiple stab wounds to the upper body. From this point, it was clear that the women of Frankston were being stalked and targeted by a serial killer. Police were unable to determine a motive to the crimes or establish a link between the victims, other than the fact that they were all young women. Two crucial pieces of evidence would be found at the scene of Natalie's murder: a leather strap, which was believed to be used to strangle Natalie, and a 2.7 by 0.5 centimeter piece of skin which featured ridges, suggesting that it came from a hand. As there were no equivalent injuries on Natalie Russell, the evidence became a vital clue for the investigators to provide a DNA match between the offender and the crime scene, a nexus between Natalie and whoever killed her. The struggle that Natalie endured may have saved countless other women. Shortly after Operation Pulsar began, two young constables reported a lead to the task force after reporting an incident on the day prior to Natalie Russell's murder. They were called to attend Sky Road in Frankston after a suspicious man slouching in the driver's seat of a yellow-coloured Toyota Corona without any registration plates was reported by a local postal worker. The occupant of the vehicle appeared to be on the lookout for something and seemed to try to not be noticed. The vehicle was spotted on the opposite side of the road near the entry point of the bike track where Natalie was murdered. Shortly after it was reported, the police had arrived to inspect the vehicle, but the driver had left. They would notice an interim registration label on the front windscreen and would look around the area, knocking on doors to find any helpful information. The car would be registered to a Paul Charles Denyer, an unemployed 21-year-old Frankston local who was living right at the center of the area police and their profiler had targeted. The following day, on 31st of July 1993, detectives Mick Hughes, Rod Wilson and Darren O'Loughlin would arrive at the address of Paul Denyer, a small block of flats on Frankston Dandenong Road in Seaford, just on the border of Frankston. Paul opened the door and greeted the officers. He answered the officers' questions freely and was very cooperative, but Inspector Wilson noticed something. Paul had numerous cuts across his fingers, with a significant cut on his left middle finger. They invited him to the station and Paul agreed to attend. By 9:23 p.m. on 31st of July 1993, just a day after Natalie Russell's body was found, Paul was being interviewed. Paul told the officers that his car had overheated near the golf course and that he'd cut his fingers fixing a loose hose. His story was neat, rapid with the details, and full of coincidences that placed him in the areas of the murders on the same days that they occurred. The investigators' suspicions grew with every minute that passed in the interview. While he recounted his day's events, a search warrant had been executed on his flat and his vehicle. Inside, the police would find knives, stained clothing, and notably, in his yellow car, they would find a pair of binoculars with a missing strap. When they searched through his tools, they would discover a pair of pliers. The police knew that every pair of pliers leaves a unique cutting edge, similar to how no two fingerprints are the same. Forensic testing would later prove that those same pliers had cut the holes in the wire fence near where Natalie had been killed. Back at the station, Paul's quick answers began to unsettle the detectives. He could recall every minute on every day that Elizabeth, Debbie, and Natalie were murdered without any pause to think. Then, the police began discussing the injuries on Paul's hands. They would request a sample of Paul's blood and other tissues for the purpose of confirming or disproving his involvement in the murders, to which Paul agreed. Shortly after the officers made the request, they stepped out for a short break, and Paul began to panic. Paul would ask how long DNA testing would take and whether the police already had samples to compare against. He knew that the truth was closing in. The game was almost up. As they waited for the forensic team, Paul noticed Detective O'Loughlin's crucifix, which led them to discussing Christianity. The conversation would seem to have resulted in a moral awakening within Paul. As they talked, he paused for a moment and casually volunteered, "Okay, I killed all three of them." At 4 a.m. on the morning of 1st of August 1993, Paul Denyer began his confession to the murders of Elizabeth Stevens, Debbie Freem, and Natalie Russell, and the attack on Rosa Toth. He told them that on a rainy night in June, he saw Elizabeth Stevens walking home from a bus stop in Langwarrin. He didn't know her. He was just, quote, looking for someone to kill. Elizabeth Stevens just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Denyer stalked her through the dense rain, eventually catching her from behind. While pretending to hold a gun, which in fact was a piece of aluminium piping with a wooden handle, he threatened her, saying that he'd shoot her if she screamed or tried to escape. Denyer forced Elizabeth into the bushland at Lloyd Park, where he choked her until she passed out, before pulling out his knife and began stabbing her throat. But miraculously, or devastatingly, she was still alive. She somehow managed to stand up and walk before Denyer caught her and threw her back on the ground, sticking his foot into her neck to, quote, finish her off. Before leaving, Denyer stomped on her face, breaking several of her facial bones. He described every motion in chilling detail, reenacting the stabbing and Elizabeth's death rattles for the detectives, shaking them to their core. Denyer told the police that he dragged Elizabeth's body to a drain and left it before it was found shortly after. When asked why he committed the murders, he simply said, "I just wanted to kill. I wanted to take a life because I felt mine had been taken." Then came his second attack on Rosa Toth in July. Denyer said that he stalked Rosa from behind in a park near Seaford Station. When he caught her, he covered her mouth and pressed his fake gun into her head. She fought fiercely, biting his finger to the bone. She managed to escape twice during the altercation before she finally flagged down a car. Denya fled on foot back to the nearby train station. He admitted to the police that he intended on dragging her into the park to kill her. About an hour later, and still hungry for blood, he saw Debbie Freem leaving her grey Pulsar and go into the local milk bar. As she shopped, he climbed into her car and hid beside the baby seat, completely indifferent to the fact that he was just about to take the life of a young mother. He waited until she turned the car on, so nobody would hear her scream. When she put the car into gear and was performing a U-turn, he startled her, which caused her to keep turning and drive into the wall of the milk bar, causing the dent on the bonnet. Denya held the fake gun to her side and ordered her to drive. He directed her to an area he knew well and pulled a cord from his pocket. He then proceeded to strangle her for about 5 minutes until she lost consciousness. While Debbie was unconscious, Denya took out a homemade pocket knife he hid in his sock and repeatedly stabbed her in the neck, chest, and stomach. When he was finished, he hid her body in a row of nearby trees, covering her with a couple of branches. He dumped her car near his house, and he would return the following day to steal her groceries and her purse, which he later buried at a nearby golf course. When asked why by the detectives, he again said, "Just wanted to." Finally, he described killing 17-year-old Natalie Russell. This time, his murder was planned in advance, though he didn't have a particular victim in mind. Earlier that day, he used pliers to cut 3 large holes in a wire fence along a bike track between 2 golf courses. At about 2:30 p.m, Denya waited for a victim carrying a homemade knife and leather strap. Once he selected his target, he stalked her, and as she approached the holes in the fence, he would grab her at knife point and drag her into the dense vegetation. Denya strangled Natalie with such great force that it snapped the strap. Once it snapped, he began stabbing her repeatedly. Denya delivered his story in extreme and graphic detail to the officers as to exactly what he did with Natalie's body, which nearly made the detectives physically ill. When he was finished, he concealed his blood-soaked hands in his pocket and walked back to his car. But when he saw police taking down his car's registration, he walked home instead of approaching them. Later, Denya went on to confess to the slaughter of Donna's cats, saying that he'd originally gone there to, quote, cut Donna's throat because he didn't like her. When he entered the home and found nobody there, he unleashed his fury on her cats. When asked by Detective O'Loughlin why all of his victims were women, Denya's answer was blunt, saying, "I just hate them, women in general." Paul Denya seemed, by all accounts, ordinary. He was an overweight, 6 foot tall, 21-year-old man from Campbelltown, New South Wales. Born in 1972, he was the third of 6 children to English working-class immigrants. His family moved to Victoria in 1981, and Paul found it particularly difficult to make the adjustment. At an early age, Paul dissected his sister's teddy bear with a homemade knife. By age 10, he slit the throat of the family cat before hanging its body from a tree in the backyard. By 14, he was fantasizing about murder. He drifted through school and jobs, fascinated by his collection of weapons and violence. Paul would be charged with a number of offences during his teenage years, including stealing a car, making false reports to the fire brigade, and assault. At work, he once, allegedly, deliberately knocked down a woman and child with a convoy of shopping trolleys, and at another job, he allegedly slaughtered goats for his own amusement. He moved into a flat on Frankston Dandenong Road, Seaford, with his girlfriend Sharon in 1992, only streets away from where he'd commit his killing spree. Denya hid his darkness well behind an unremarkable facade, as Sharon would be none the wiser about his involvement in the murders. By 1993, Denya was isolated, unemployed, and consumed by resentment. He'd failed police training on the account of being overweight, he'd been fired from 7 jobs, and he began to turn his rage outward. Over 7 weeks, 3 innocent women were dead, and a 4th had narrowly escaped. In December of 1993, Denya pleaded guilty to all charges. Court-appointed psychologist Ian Joblin testified that Denya showed no remorse and gained intense gratification from his intentional maltreatment of his victims. Dr. Joblin would say that Paul Denya was a very rare breed, a killer who murdered at random and without motive, making him the most dangerous kind of criminal. Denya would be diagnosed with sadistic personality disorder but declared sane. Paul Denya would be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. During his sentencing, Justice Frank Vincent said, "The apprehension you have caused to thousands of women in the community will be felt for a long time. For many, you are the fear that quickens their step as they walk home or cause a parent to look anxiously at the clock when a child is late." In 1994, Denya's appeal reduced his sentence to life with a 30-year non-parole period, sparking outrage across Victoria. In somewhat of an ironic twist, Paul Denya would release a letter from prison in 2003 announcing that he identified as a woman, calling himself Paula Denya, and claiming that the gender dysphoria had fueled his hatred for women. However, years later, he reverted to identifying as Paul once again. In 2023, when his parole eligibility arrived, over 32,000 people signed a petition demanding that he remain behind bars. The board denied his release, and he continues to serve his sentence. Today, the bike track where Natalie Russell died has been renamed to Nat's Track. A bronze sculpture adorned with 17 everlasting daisies stands there, one for each year of her life. A quiet tribute to Natalie and to every victim whose ordinary day ended at the hands of Paul Denya.